Alright, AP World, let's talk about the Cold War in the Middle East now. Alright, so it's important for us to realize that one of the main there's sort of a dual reason why these major powers in the Cold War are so interested in the Middle East. One of them is left over from the end of World War One. You may remember that the mandate system after World War One made it so that many of these Middle Eastern countries, despite what they thought would be a promise of self-determination, were actually still influenced by countries like Britain and France for a number of decades after the Second World War ended. What we do see, though, by the end of World War II is that most states in the Middle East do not have major problems gaining independence from Britain and France. So if you take a look at this map, all the dates that are in parentheses are dates of independence of these various states. So I just wanted to mention specifically that if you look in the north, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Jordan gained full independence pretty much right after the Second World War ends. But the oil-rich nature of the region meant that Western countries still had a vested interest and would occasionally interfere militarily in other parts of the Middle East. So just notice that places that have a larger oil production rate actually have later independence dates, and that is not really a coincidence there. There's also an issue with a promise that was left over from World War I that the British people made to the Jewish population in Europe, and of course that has to do with the creation of the State of Israel. And so let's rewind a little bit to the end of World War I again. Hopefully you remember that in 1917, Great Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, and basically that was Great Britain's support for a Jewish state in the Middle East. Now, of course, Israel is not created until 1948, but after the Balfour Declaration, you saw a dramatic increase in the number of migrants, of European Jews, to what will become the State of Israel. Okay, so it's not yet created, but there still already is a migration. Now, at first, the British are torn between allowing Jews to freely migrate to the region as well as to protect Palestinians who live there. So at first, the British tried to limit the migration of Jews, but of course, as the problems in Europe leading up to and during World War I unfold, Europeans grow increasingly committed to creating and protecting a Jewish state in the region. The problem is that with this increased migration into the Middle East among Jews, there is a growing tension between Jews and Palestinians in this region. This also is elevated by the growth of Pan-Arabism in the Middle East. In general, they want to create more of a sense of in certain instances, Islamism, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and Pan-Arabism go hand in hand. The idea is that these countries also need to have self-determination, and they believe that the Arab nature of their culture needs to be part of that self-determination. So naturally, when there are Jews moving into that region, for Pan-Arabs, that was seen as a problem. So when we move into the post-war era, we see that this essentially shapes an ongoing conflict that, of course, continues till today. So after World War II, the United Nations General Assembly proposed to divide the region of Palestine into two separate states, one Arab, one Jewish. This initial UN General Assembly proposal was rejected, and after that, civil war broke out between Arabs and Jews. The British end up withdrawing from the region in 1948, and then Israel declares its independence. So Israel is officially created as a state in 1948, but the conflicts continue at this point without British presence in the region. So there was a series of subsequent conflicts, which you can actually see highlighted on this timeline. I know that this is also something that you emphasize pretty heavily in Judaics classes. So I'm operating under an assumption that you're pretty familiar with these events, in particular, of course, the Six-Day War and the acquisition of increasing territory for Israel as time goes on. Um, Essentially, what you see is that as the state of Israel continues to gain territory, increasing numbers of Palestinians leave the region as refugees. Some of them go to nearby places like Lebanon and Jordan, but there's continued violence in the region, and its future still remains unstable. Of course, I think this is an even more pressing issue with current U.S. and Israel relations. For example, the proposal to turn Jerusalem into the new location for the American ambassador. Jerusalem is an international city, as I'm sure you know. The current location of the ambassador and the embassy is in Tel Aviv, which is part of Israel. So, of course, we'll see how this continued conflict pans out. But this is all, in a lot of ways, left over from the legacy of colonialism, decolonization, and the idea, of course, that Britain withdraws very quickly and then essentially leaves this relatively unstable region to hash out its problems on its own. We could certainly compare this to what happens in the creation of India and Pakistan, which was also largely a part of Great Britain. Okay, so let's talk about Egypt now. In 1952, there was a revolution in Egypt. It was a bloodless coup where a new president assumes power. The bloodless coup overthrew the king of Egypt. And then the new president was Gamal Abdel Nasser, or rather, prime minister, not president. My apologies, I just misspoke there. But in any case, he's a very good example of pan-Arabism in the state of Egypt specifically. So he's really trying to make Egypt's economy as independent as possible from foreign influence. I just did a series of videos on Latin America, and in some ways we could compare this, let's say, to Mexican President Cardenas' land reforms and his nationalization of oil. It's very similar. So Nasser nationalizes some industries in Egypt, including banks, which is significant because then Egypt doesn't have the same sort of financial dependency on Western countries like it did during the colonial era when the Suez Canal was constructed, right? He also instituted some land reform. He transformed private farms into socialist cooperatives. And the most important thing that he does, which leads to the Suez Crisis, which I'll talk about on the next slide, is that he nationalizes the Suez Canal, which essentially meant that he was trying to keep international vessels and other influences outside of the Suez Canal. By nationalizing it, he was saying that the canal belonged to Egypt. He also adopted the policy of non-alignment. This is the same thing that India did. It did not want to have, Egypt that is, did not want to have an imperialistic relationship with either the US or the USSR. So essentially what the non-alignment movement means is that they didn't want to take either side in the Cold War, which is very significant. It did try, Nasser and Egypt did, though, try to play the US and the USSR off one another for economic and military assistance. So the non-alignment was also a really strategic position because he knew that both Cold War superpowers were going to try to vie to have a closer relationship with Egypt. Egypt also, along with its pan-Arabism, was very anti-Israel. We'll see also how that pans out in the Suez Crisis. And Nasser was committed to assisting pan-Arab movements elsewhere in Africa. So, for example, with the Algerian independence movement, Nasser was very supportive in helping Algerians against continued French influence and ultimately and government over the region. So he was this huge supporter of the Algerian independence movement. And let's move on to the Suez Crisis. As I was saying earlier, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, and then he moved to construct the Aswan Dam in the region. So the idea now was that any type of transportation or trade that went through the Suez Canal, this was something that Egypt now controlled. Prior to the nationalization, the Suez Canal was seen as an international zone. The British wanted that international control back. If we go all the way back to the days when the canal was constructed, we know that this was really, in a lot of ways, an imperialistic tug-of-war game between the British and French influence over Egypt. So, of course, when Egypt tries to take back ownership of the canal, countries that had worked to establish the canal in the first place want to fight to continue to have access to it. So that's why they ask for international control. Nasser very clearly refuses the British demands, and so in response, the British, French, and Israeli forces decide to militarily intervene in the region. So the British, French, and Israeli forces launch a military campaign against Egypt. You can see it here. This is all the Suez Canal. So it ends up failing, partly because there's actually a blockade issued by Egypt on Israel. The U.S. actually is another reason why the Suez Crisis, or the Western military intervention in the Suez Crisis, fails. The U.S. was not consulted before the intervention started, and the U.S. actually, along with the USSR, spoke out and condemned the attacks. And then after that, the U.S. president, who was Dwight Eisenhower at the time, spoke out again against this intervention in Egypt, and he pledged what subsequently became called the Eisenhower Doctrine. And so what the Eisenhower Doctrine meant was that the U.S. was now the dominant influential power over the Middle East. If you've taken U.S. history and you're familiar with different presidential doctrines, you're aware that doctrines aren't actual laws, but that they're sort of a statement in political philosophy. So the Monroe Doctrine, for example, was a statement that the U.S. should have more influence over the Western Hemisphere than European nations, right? So the Eisenhower Doctrine is an interesting step in a new direction because the U.S. Geography-wise is quite far from the Middle East, and certainly it would seem, at least from a geographic perspective, not to make sense for the U.S. to have more of a role shaping this region than countries like Britain and France. So the other significant thing about the Suez Crisis, I think, from a global perspective, is that we're seeing the U.S. really take on the role of more of a global power after World War II ends. Eventually, the Suez Crisis ends. The canal returns to being an international waterway, and the UN deploys peacekeepers to the region to keep it that way. But despite the fact that the Suez Crisis does end, in this whole process, Nasser gains a really significant reputation for being a leader in the Pan-Arab movement. We already know that Nasser was supportive of things like Algerian independence, but he really puts himself on the map here as a spokesperson for just nationalism among Arab nations. So that's really, I guess I started to speak ahead of myself. Some of the things I wanted to mention just now are really epitomized in this slide. But Nasser also continues to oppose Israel. The USSR and the U.S., however, support Israel's right to exist. So that's another, I think, important thing to realize, that the Pan-Arab movement in general is also taking a pretty significant stance in how Europe, in particular, is influencing the Middle East. You can see that they feel that Israel's presence in the Middle East was a result of unnecessary, in his opinion, European intervention in the region. So in a lot of ways, his opposition to Israel is just as much of a rejection of European influence in the region as it is an opposition to the existence of a Jewish state. that, of course, the Arab-Israeli conflict then complicated international matters with regard to the Middle East. And this is particularly the case as demands for oil continue to rise, and, of course, as Israel grows in its international presence and there is a continued global desire to support Israel. All right, so let's talk about the growth of Islamism in the Middle East. So Islamism is more of an ideological idea. It's not necessarily political, but it really rose because the post-colonial Arab world was still very divided, right? We know that really dating back to almost the establishment of Islam to begin with, there was an internal divide between Shias and Sunnis. So when Islamism started to grow, there was arguably less of an emphasis on the divide between Shia and Sunni, but rather an emphasis on Islamic values as a whole. So we could see potentially Islamism as a way to reconcile the differences between Shia and Sunni in an effort to try to expand Muslim influence over Arab regions. So with Islamism, the idea behind it is to indoctrinate Islam into all parts of public life. So Islamists call for rigorous enforcement of Sharia law, and they hope to eradicate non-Muslim political, economic, and social influences. One of the misnomers that we get coming from the West about Islamism is, at least in terms of the numbers that we know, Islamists are still predominantly peaceful, but with the way that our media functions and the way that we see things from an outside perspective, we see a lot more representation of the extremist minority that does call for violence, the extremist minority that interprets a jihad as the right and duty to defend Islam using violence as necessary. So in general, the revival of Islamism is seen as a cause for concern among Western non-Muslim countries. And again, actually, we could see this as well as a significant response in the Arab world to European influences over the region, that they want their own self-determination, and Islamism was the way they saw that happening. Another good example of opposition to Western rule would be the Iranian Revolution. So going back to the 1950s, in 1953, the CIA actually helped bring the Shah of Iran into power. All right, so this is because the Shah, whose name was Mohammad Pahlavi, he actually, first off, he was, like I said before, he was brought to power by the CIA, and in exchange, the U.S. supplied Iran with military supplies, and the U.S. got to benefit from Iran's oil industry. So Iranians resented the fact that the U.S. actually was behind the elevation of this man to power, right? This is sort of seen as a complete rejection of their self-determination. So internal opposition to the Shah started to rise, and along with that, resentment of Americans, because they saw this as, again, just a challenge to their ability to govern themselves. In 1979, Shia Muslims deposed the Shah of Iran, and he fled the country into exile. So then they replaced the Shah with a man who was in exile at the time. His name was the Ayatollah Khomeini, and he returns to Iran in 1979 from exile, and he emerges as the new leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So the Iranian Revolution is a very good example, again, of the rejection of Western influences over the region. And we can see here some representations, the ways in which Iranians felt about the Shah, right, the U.S. puppet, right, and the ways in which they really revered Ayatollah Khomeini as his replacement. Another way in which we see the continued resentment of the U.S. in Iran is the Iranian hostage crisis. The Shah, the same man who was deposed in 1979, he actually was diagnosed with cancer, and he ends up going to the United States to receive medical treatment. So Iranians end up rejecting that very much. They're still upset about the fact that in 1953 the U.S. brought the Shah to power to begin with. So they end up retaliating against this by capturing and holding 69 different hostages from the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. The hostages, they remained hostage for 444 days. The hostage crisis, there were attempts by the U.S. president at the time, it was Jimmy Carter, to negotiate with the extremists who were holding the hostages, but those attempts failed. There was an attempt to rescue them by helicopter, which also failed. And the hostages eventually are released, and it's symbolic because they were released on the same day that Ronald Reagan was inaugurated in 1981. So it sort of forever left a stain on Jimmy Carter's presidency because it was seen as a failure in his foreign policy. But nonetheless, just the fact that the Iranian hostage crisis took place is yet another example of the resistance to Western influence over the region. Okay, and then moving on a little bit closer to the present, in 1980, the president of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, launched an invasion on Iran. And the reason why this was predominantly a religious conflict. Iran was a Shia country that is surrounded by Sunni countries. So Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, thought that it could easily defeat Iran because at the time, of course, this starts in 1980, so Iran is still in the midst of their own revolution. So Iraq is thinking this is going to be an easy defeat because Iran is preoccupied. But Iran nonetheless did counterattack, and the result was a war of attrition that lasted for 8 years. Up to 1 million soldiers were killed in the process, and the end result really was fairly inconsequential. There were no major border changes in the region. And post-war Iran is characterized by a greater sense of Islamic orthodoxy. So part of this is because the conservative leadership under President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad worked to alienate Iran from the U.S. by developing its nuclear program and expressing anti-Israel sentiments. And we know, of course, that the U.S. has remained a very staunch ally of Israel throughout the 20th century. So in general, the U.S.-Iran relationship has not been particularly good since the Iran-Iraq War. And then last but not least, we see another instance of instability in the Middle East with the Gulf War in 1990 to 1991. Saddam Hussein, still president of Iraq, right? He invaded Kuwait, this very small and oil-rich nation along the Persian Gulf. And he ends up getting defeated because there is an international coalition led by the United States that steps in to stop this invasion of Kuwait. The significance behind the Gulf War is that the Iraqi defeat was the desire of the U.S. to achieve what they call a new world order after the Cold War. So the idea, just like we saw with the Eisenhower Doctrine, with the Suez Crisis, is that the U.S. now is acting as, in a way, sort of the world police, right? Kuwait is very far away, of course, from the U.S. sphere of influence, but nonetheless, the U.S. felt that it was its duty to protect this smaller region from Iraqi aggression. But the other reason that the U.S. was so interested in protecting Kuwait is because this was a significant oil-producing region. And so if Kuwait was backed by the U.S., then that could result in some pretty significant benefits to the U.S. Oil supply. The result of the Gulf War, rather, is that there was increasing tension between the U.S. and Iraq. U.S. forces remained in Iraq after the conflict, which angered many, and it started to ignite some increased anti-U.S. sentiment, anti-Western and anti-U.S. terrorist organizations such as Al-Qaeda, and that was actually one of the major reasons why the Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden continued to oppose Western influence over the Middle East. And eventually, of course, we could argue that this is sort of a precursor to the Iran-Iraq war, or sorry, to the, why do I keep saying Iran-Iraq? The U.S.-Iraq war, which starts in 2005, right? So, the left actually very much criticized the Gulf War because they saw this as a rationalization for imperialist ambitions in the Middle East. They saw it as a fight for oil, and they rejected that idea. In general, we could argue that some of the continued resentment among the U.S. is because of the U.S.'s desire to intervene in many of these conflicts, despite their distance from the region. So that about wraps it up for what's going on in the Middle East during the Cold War. And the awesome news is that we literally only have one more chunk of videos left, and that's on globalization. And then we're just going to get all set for this AP exam and then finish out the year. So thanks for sticking with me throughout the year with all these videos. And just one more section left. Get ready for it. Stay tuned, and thanks.